Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of everything that's going on to join us on today's webinar, Trauma-Informed Empowerment for AAPI Resiliency Through Services or Tiers in the Time of COVID-19. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box and respond to this poll that we have up. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Live captioning is available by going to this link that I just put in the chat box, or you can go to captionedtext.com, and at the top right you're going to see a little rectangle, a little form box, and put in the confirmation number 4547437. And we're going to have this information up on all the slides in case you need it. So I'm sure you're all way more familiar with Zoom nowadays than you ever thought that you would be or ever wanted to be. I know I am. But in case you need assistance with the technology, either write me in the chat box or you can send an email to sluo@api-gbv.org, and I'll do my best to respond. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the chat box to ask questions for the presenters or share insight, share experiences, share resources, but do keep in mind that it is a public chat box, so be mindful of any information or names that you are sharing in there. We will be recording this webinar, making it available on our website after today, but the recording will not show your names or the chat box. So I'm just watching the, everybody kind of join in here. So in terms of introductions, hello, my name is Shirley Liu. I am the Resource Center Coordinator with API-GBV, or the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. I use she, her pronouns. In case you're not familiar with API-GBV, we are a national resource center on gender-based violence affecting Asian and Pacific Islander communities. Our role is to develop resources, training, technical assistance, and advocacy, including policy advocacy, to support the work of anyone who's engaging Asian and Pacific Islander survivors and communities to end violence. You can learn a little bit more about what we do at our website, api-gbv.org. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of the agenda. Before we get started, I'm going to give a super brief introduction on trauma and how it shows up on Asian Pacific Islander communities before I turn it over to our amazing presenters. They will discuss trauma-informed approaches in supporting survivors through legal and immigration-related challenges. Fatima from CPAF will share further about trauma-informed care in emergency and transitional shelter and how it looks a little bit different now in the present moment of COVID-19. And then finally, Nat, also from CPAF, will share some findings from a needs assessment that they conducted of their community in Los Angeles and some of the cultural dynamics impacting the API survivor experience. We will leave some time for questions at the end. So like I said, feel free to write those in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will do our best to get to them. So we wanted to make some time to talk about this term, Asians and Pacific Islanders. At the Institute, and I think this is common for many of you, we include in the term API or AAPI, anyone who comes from or is part of the diaspora community from these regions that you see on this little map here. So anywhere from West Asian in the Middle East to East Asia, Southeast Asia, also including the Pacific Islands. So sometimes that would include New Zealanders and Native Hawaiians, depending on how you self-identify. So as you can see, it's a super diverse range, and experiences, religion, culture, languages, et cetera, vary greatly, not only from what country you're coming from, but from each person's individual background. So sometimes we do risk oversimplification when we talk about these things in the aggregate, like when we use the term API culture. So just something to keep in mind as we go through this webinar. Some of you might be familiar with this image. This is the lifetime spiral of gender violence. We use it as a framework to help understand the experiences of Asian and Pacific Islander survivors. Although we have seen that folks have adapted it to use in different communities as well. So this is a useful framework way of illustrating how gender-based violence can affect individuals from infancy through childhood and adolescence to adulthood and later in life, and how many survivors have experience with not only several different forms of abuse, as you can see in this diagram, but also at the hands of several perpetrators, including their family, their extended family, their partners, strangers, and their own children. So all that to say that when a survivor is coming to shelter for services, even though in that present moment they may be seeking a specific service like a protection order or childcare, they can carry with them experiences of abuse, from all along this lifetime spiral that aren't showing up immediately or that aren't being named in this moment. So just something to keep in mind as we talk about trauma. In terms of trauma, for Asian and Pacific Islanders, as we saw in the lifetime spiral, trauma can come from violence that someone experiences or witnessed happen to someone else. These types of violence from the lifetime spiral. They can also come from negative experiences with help seeking. So for instance, a domestic violence survivor who is going to a mainstream shelter and one of the staff makes a comment, "I thought that was normal in your culture. Abuse is normal in your culture, I thought." Just having the staff member dismiss that. Or for instance, a queer trans survivor in shelter being shunned or subjected to hate by the other survivors in the shelter. So that's something that can create trauma. It can come from prolonged or repeated interactions with others who've gone through trauma, whether in their community or whether, from someone who works a lot with survivors, can experience this form of secondary trauma. It can come from historical persecution and oppression that may have resulted in them being displaced from their home, displaced from their country, the refugee experience, the experience with resettlement, just all the traumatic things that can happen in that journey. It can come out of daily microaggressions, hate, harassment on the basis of one's race, gender expression, sexual orientation, the way one looks. In particular, in this moment, we've seen a rise of anti-Asian hate and harassment because of some of the rhetoric surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's no way to predict whether an event will be traumatic or will cause trauma. Two people can go through the exact same thing and be impacted in completely different ways. One of them can suffer severe trauma. One of them may not be impacted at all. So that being said, there has been some research done that suggests that some of the common elements that could lead to lasting trauma are intense fear or distress, prolonged stress, helplessness, feeling loss of control. So just feeling like you're not able to prepare or not able to control what will happen next. You can't predict or control what's going to happen to you. A lot of these elements are present in an event that would lead to trauma later on. So there's all sorts of studies showing, where trauma shows up in the brain and why it happens the way it does from a biological or evolutionary level. But maybe to oversimplify, there are trauma triggers that will kick in an instinctive response from the brain. And that's often what we think of when we think of fight, freeze, or flight. And these triggers can be anything from maybe hearing a song that your abuser used to play all the time, or smelling the scent of a dish that was prepared a lot in your childhood or something like that. A lot of just mundane everyday things that are, out of context would be completely harmless, but when they kick in, can change somebody's mood drastically. And so a survivor who's experiencing trauma can go from being pleasant and open in 1 minute to, withdrawing or lashing out in anger, behaviors that would seem counterproductive and counterintuitive in the moment. So as advocates, it's important for us to understand this and operate from this sort of framework, because we can't make sure that we're 100% going to be avoiding triggering somebody's trauma. In fact, a survivor themselves may not know what their triggers are. But if we understand and we operate from a trauma-informed framework, then we can respond with empathy and support, and support them through their healing process. And as for how exactly we do that, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to hand it off to our presenters. I want to introduce you first to Dr. Nusrat Amin, who is the Senior Director at DAIA and runs the legal clinic there. She's going to talk a little bit about legal challenges associated with trauma.
Just remember to unmute myself. Good afternoon. Thank you, API-GBV, for having us present today, and Shirley for putting all this thing together. And thank you everyone who are here, joined us. It's a timely discussion at the time of pandemic. And as you all know, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men experience domestic and sexual violence in their lifetime. According to a CDC report, half of the women murdered in USA were killed by an intimate partner. And this shows the lethality, and that it is not just a private matter, but rather a public health concern. Now, and next slide, please. So who we are and how we surface and what are our services. DAIA is a Sanskrit word meaning compassion, and DAIA was founded in 1996 after a tragic murder-suicide where a South Asian woman with 3 children murdered the 3 children, and the husband caught the house on fire and killed herself. 7 South Asian women came together and created DAIA to prevent such incidences further. Domestic violence is an issue in the South Asian community as it is in all other communities. What makes us unique? That we focus on South Asian families. Look at the map. These are the countries that we represent, but we do not close our doors to anyone who calls us. We speak 12 South Asian languages between the both staff and the volunteers. We are one of the 35 South Asian agencies, domestic violence agencies in the USA. DAIA's experience with women and from the South Asian community suggests that most clients prefer an advocate from their own culture and who understand the issue particular to the community. Abused women often hesitate to go to the mainstream, as Shirley just mentioned, because of different barriers. Research shows only 50% of the women who experience the intimate partner violence are aware of the services even. We recognize that the trauma is any event, action, or process that leads to a significant negative impact on a person. For example, a survivor who was very eager to obtain the services from your organization may rapidly change her attitude and refuse services, or may even seem withdrawn or resistant. We are very mindful of each survivor's journey to empowerment is different, and we commit to working with each individual at their pace, at the emotional level that is a trauma-informed. We are extremely mindful to our communication with survivors, ourselves, our stakeholders. We work very closely with mainstream organizations and the shelters while clients stay there. Now, what are DAIA services? DAIA services are twofold: direct and preventive. We have a confidential helpline where we do the crisis intervention, we do case management, we have a licensed counselor to counsel the survivors. Being immigrant, most DAIA's clients don't have a support system in the USA, and we understand that homelessness is associated with domestic violence. Through our housing program and the government grants, we address this by providing rental assistance case basis. DAIA's majority clients are first-generation immigrants, and we realize that most of the clients are not aware of the rights in the USA. And moreover, many being dependent on the abuser's visa are often trapped in the relationship in fear of losing immigration, being deported, and consequently fear of losing the custody. In the light of all these complications, DIA started the legal clinic program in 2008 with some private attorneys who believe in our mission and the pro bono legal aids to educate the clients of the rights that exist under the family law and the immigration laws. For example, we need VAWA, U visas, asylum to help our survivors to make an informed choice. Through our BIA program, we help survivors with immigration filing. Through our preventive and education and outreach program at DIA, we work to inform, engage, mobilize the South Asian community, including families, individuals, community advocates, religion organization, and other institutions in the movement to end violence against women. Through our preventive program, we do advocacy at the policy level to impact systems change. Next slide, please. Culture is extremely important component of human life. Culture here refers to all these factors that you see that characterizes specific groups. Domestic violence, sexual assault, and inherent dynamics of power control are correlated. While a survivor seeks services to your organization, other life circumstances have shaped that person who they are at the point reaching out to you. Thus, lending a cultural lens to domestic violence means that services cannot take a one-size-fits-all approach, and that we cannot expect the same intervention and approaches to fit all. And it is very important that the programs are designed to address this. If you look at the wheel, you will notice that it is similar to the Duluth power control wheel, like isolation, financial control, etc. But what here is more important is how the cultural wheel has all these cultural divide that makes the DIA client or the immigrant clients more susceptible to all these barriers. For example, immigration abuse. Immigration clients whose visas are dependent on abusers find it harder, and in some cases, if they don't have a work authorization like H-4 visa holders, and the finances are totally controlled by the abusers, they have a child born in USA, and if they are divorced, she will be deported and the child will be here in the USA. Lack of trust also combines to that. Immigrants hold the mindset from home country about the legal system and do not trust the police or other formal system out of the family. And if this H-4 holder does not call the police to report the assault, she may not be even eligible to apply under the U visa. There are other unique abuses that we see is in-law abuse, because we come from a culture of collectivism and family comes first. A lot of the times we see that in joint family system, the in-laws make a lot of decision. Transnational abandonment is another one that we see where by coercive means survivors are taken to the home country and live there without immigration documents. We see it in DIA clients oftentimes. Or they're married to a person living abroad who goes and honeymoons and leaves the victim, but never bring them to the USA. The religion abuse or spiritual abuse is another one that we see, where abusers are routinely using religion as a tool to abuse. And I would really encourage all of you to put all your questions there so that we can answer them at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So it is harder to, when all these barriers are already there and now there is COVID. It is harder, next slide please. It is harder to communicate when the abuser is at home. Advocates are seeking creative ways to communicate with the survivors. We are letting our clients know to create code words or sentences with the children and neighbors in the case of emergency to call police. For example, Olive, or I would like to order donuts. DIA, through different grants funding, are trying to meet the basic needs that has arisen more now with the COVID, like food and grocery, the purchasing or getting gift cards for grocery. We are also getting laptops, tablets for the clients to keep communicating with us and continue their counseling or case management through Doxy. .me, and we are Doxy.me, and we are also, and the children can also attend their classes online. Of course, there is shelter scarcity now because of the social distancing. The shelters who can, have capacity of 40 and now are having only 12% living there. But this is also being addressed by the state and the city, and they're creating spaces to accommodate for the survivors to hotels. DAYA is also helping with limited hotel stay. The abusers are depriving survivors the government relief fund. And some of them have also applied joint, where they have separated just to receive that 1,200 COVID relief. And that it is associated with eviction issues also. Many of the clients have lost jobs and cannot maintain rental assistance. DAYA is addressing this eviction by connecting the clients to our attorneys who believe in our mission and the legal aids. Survivors are now confused whether they can call police, whether police will even come at the time of COVID. COVID is creating all these barriers and complications. We had clients recanting their statements when police communicated over phone, and the abuser sitting in front of her making threats to kill her by his body language. Next slide, please. And on top of that, tech-enabled abuse is also creating a lot of barriers. Technology can help survivors reach out, but it can also be used to further control abuse. 97% of the DV organizations report that perpetrators use tech abuse. During the pandemic, use of technology has increased, but it can survive to get all the help that they need. So technology has become a tool to abuse, no doubt. During COVID, it is more apparent in our clients. We tell our clients to create new emails, change passwords, have a code, text when they're texting with the advocates. Next slide, please. Tell the clients to switch off the location on the phone and car when she's planning to leave. Tell her to leave when the abuser is not home. And research indicates that 90% of the murders happen at this time. Again, this is because abusers feel they are losing the power and control. Next slide, please. So racial justice and intersection of domestic violence. National Resource Center to End Domestic Violence, NRCDV's recent 2020 study shows domestic violence is inextricably linked to all forms of violence, and to end this domestic violence, we must dismantle anti-Blackness, other types of racism, discrimination, and structures that perpetuate oppression. The recent newsletter from them highlights resources for centering racial and economic justice in our effort to prevent domestic and sexual violence. This is there is an intersection between the racial justice and how one views law enforcement and related justice. We often hear from the police that the survivors of color will not leave, or even if they leave, they will return to the abuser. A 2015 survey by the ACLU shows deep concerns about the bias and police treatment of victims from women of color. In New Orleans, for example, 83% of the domestic violence misdemeanors were dismissed. Next slide, please. So, and on this slide, you will see that the ACLU in 2018 has showed how it's so difficult and become harder to investigate. From 69% in 2017, it increased to 82% of prosecutors, showing that how it is now underreported and harder to investigate and prosecute. Next slide, please. So there was a national survey of the advocates, of 715 advocates from 46 states showed that 62% had fear in applying immigration or had questions about their safety. 43% of the advocates worked with immigrant survivors who dropped the civil and criminal case because they were fearful to continue the cases. 3 out of 4 advocates say that survivors fear to go to court against abusers or offenders. Next slide, please. And nearly 75% of the abused and undocumented women in one survey said that their spouse had never filed immigration papers, and even if they filed it 4 years after. Abuse rate in marriages between US citizens and immigrant women may be 3 times higher in the general US population. 65% of the women in one study showed that their abusers threatened to deportation, and so immigration becomes a bigger challenge for survivors from the immigration community. Next slide, please. So if you look at this slide, you will see that whatever I have been saying, all these things, it is just summarized in this slide which Tari has created, the barriers for the immigrant survivors, and how all these barriers culminate ultimately to trauma, and then becomes a barrier to go into the to get the civil or the criminal or immigration reliefs. Next slide, please. So what are the complex challenges and intersections? If you see this slide, you'll see that it is interesting to observe the immigrant survivors' expectations and the system's responses. Trusting police is very important. Perception is very important when a patrol officer goes to a particular incident of domestic violence, whether they have a trauma-informed cultural lens. When an officer is at the scene and trying to be in the shoes of the survivor, maybe it is not 100% possible, but at least they can be conscious about this. And when instead, they need to start a conversation with an empathetic statement, sorry, this has happened to you, and separate her from the abuser. While taking part in a law enforcement trauma response training yesterday, I found that this is not that easy. One officer said that while their office developed an LGBTQ policy, and when they went into that community, they learned that it was totally wrong. So they had to return to the LGBTQ community and learn from them how to respond. Even in recants, the department said that it is unfounded, but it is not the case, and the officers understand that, and they should. Therefore, for a systems change, we as an advocate have a great responsibility to train the different components of the criminal justice system on culture and trauma. As for reporting, University of Maryland research pointed to studies that show survivors of domestic violence are less likely to report abuse when they think that it will lead to arrest. Research shows that the police are often unsympathetic to the victims. In the 1970s, domestic violence wasn't even a crime at all. But now domestic violence calls are one of the few areas of police involvement where arrest is not only encouraged, but it is mandatory. The mandatory arrest can sometimes harm than cure. By the 21st century, an increasing number of domestic violence arrests were of women, many of whom were victims themselves. Forced to comply with mandatory arrest law, police arrested women who were acting in self-defense, or sometimes arrested both parties, a practice that is still common and that we see in our clientele. There are reasons beyond a fear of retaliation. In some cases, victims may need their partners around for financial or child care reasons. Other victims love their partners or want to keep them out of the criminal legal system. In some cases, a victim may not want to testify against the abuser if either person could face deportation. So everything is interrelated. Addressing expectations. I'll go over some of the COVID-related examples that we are coming across. My child's other parent and I have shared custody under a current custody order, but now there is a stay-home order in place. Can I keep my child home with me until the stay order is lifted? Do we still have to do the visit and exchange? Yes, you do. Under the Texas Supreme Court order that despite stay-home orders existing or court orders concerning possession and access still shall control in all instances. But I don't feel that it's safe for my child to go to the other parent's house right now. What can I do to stop visitation until it's safer? The law says you have to keep the status quo unless you want to modify the custody to show best interest of the child. My child's other parent has supervised visitation, but the visitation center is closed. The other parent is trying to tell me I have to let my child go unsupervised. Do I? You have to mutually agree to a place where it has the child visitation can happen, and you can write it down, but you can write it in writing, but it has to happen. I'm supposed to pay child support, but I just got laid off due to COVID. What should I do? You still owe the child support and need to pay at the least minimum. Your role as an advocate here is to listen, validate, at the same time, talk about the reality and explore healing and justice being with the survivor. Next slide, please. So Daya's client often tell us we want justice. Let me start with an example. Joy has limited language capacity. She and her child is abandoned by the spouse. The in-laws are pressuring that it is her fault that he left, and while he is having an affair, assaulting her, she calls the police. He's arrested but bailed on bond. Now he files a divorce and gets the joint custody. Joy may feel betrayed by the system. Why is he getting overnight visitation when he has a DWI case? And all that is mentioned, she may feel betrayed by the system. The definition of justice may look different for immigrant survivors who want to get full custody when she is abused by the spouse who has abandoned and married religiously or cheating on her. But the US law will give the abuser that equal rights unless he has a felony charge or anything that will exclude him from the custody. Here is when she finds she's not getting justice. We see in practice and in the research also indicates that some of the cases survivors are conflicted to take the abuser to the criminal court. Clients often tell us that they want to teach the abuser a lesson, but not to have them arrested. Advocates point out that often police-led approaches comes at the expense of other solutions, like funding shelters and services. Violence Against Women Act, for instance, provides ample funding for criminal arrest and prosecution, but they are very small amount goes to the social work institution. And only 15% was going, and it is still the same in reality today. So in reality, we need funding to assist the survivors with supporting services and pro bono legal aid. Advocates spend a lot of their time talking about expectations in the legal advocacy. And if it is more when the abuser's immigration is tied to the survivor. We need to keep advocates, we need to keep doing advocacy for survivors' rights as
This is Shirley Nusra. I think you are frozen. There you are. You're muted.
Sorry for the technical difference. I may have been dropped. So lastly, we need to remember how we have to be trauma informed, and when we are communicating with the clients, we need to tell the clients or the survivors that it is not an easy solution, and validate their responses. Next slide, please. And always give onus to the clients. Always remember that clients knows best and their situations, and that you are here to guide them through the situation. Thank you so much. And I'll really appreciate if you have any questions, again, to put it on the chat, and we will get back to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that insight. As she said, feel free to put your comments and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. I'm going to introduce you next to Fatima from the Center for the Pacific Asian Family, or CPAF. Fatima is the Shelter Program Director at CPAF, which serves the Asian and Pacific Islander community of Los Angeles, operating from a framework of community being at the heart of program development and evaluation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shirley. And good afternoon, everyone, or depending on what time zone you are in. I've seen the comments where the participants are from, which is Guam, Hawaii, Boston, Texas, Australia. So I suppose that this day and age of where we live in terms of the pandemic has really made us a little bit more isolated, but in these particular instances, not so much, because we're bridging the gap in terms of cultures and being able to go across so many different regions and countries. So really, thank you so much for having me and being able to share some of our experiences with COVID-19 and how it has impacted our programs, and how now more than ever, it's even more critical to understand trauma-informed practices and care in a lot of different services. So I just want to first say, definitely with what Nusrat just talked about, her services and DIA services is amazing. And it really just speaks to the incredible barriers that a lot of our survivors have in terms of trying to battle domestic violence and sexual assault, and then being able to kind of put their lives together piece by piece. So collectively, if there's anything that you take from this webinar, it's really understanding that community organizations need to work together. We all need to work together to really be proactive and progressive and impactful, positively impactful to survivors. So I will just then begin my little presentation, and definitely if you have questions or comments, there is the chat box and the Q&A, and we'll have opportunity later on to answer any kind of curiosities you have about what we're presenting on. So I'm the Shelter Program Director for Center for the Pacific Asian Family, and one of my other fantastic colleagues, Nat, will be talking after me. CPAF is an organization based in Los Angeles. For the last 42 years, we've been providing integral services for Asian Pacific Islander survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault through intervention services such as shelter services, which I will talk briefly about today, and then also an incredibly robust community program, which Nat will give her experiences and wisdom to all of you. Next slide, please. So why do we need shelters? There is always a constant debate, especially as I am coming to you from one of our emergency shelters. And in Los Angeles County, we have a huge homeless issue right now. But we also have, the pandemic that we are all living under. But there's also another pandemic, which has been going on for generations upon generations, which is domestic and intimate partner violence. So why do we need shelters? I'm pretty sure that I'm preaching to the choir in terms of the participants and the people who are listening to this, but we do need shelter because violence does happen, and it happens on a minute basis. And this was something that I took from the United Nations office, really indicating like how severe violence is, and really just looking at women and girls accounting for a smaller share of victims of homicide in general than men. That they bear the greatest burden of intimate partner family related homicide and intimate partner homicide. So really looking at how we can provide refuge for them in shelters, because oftentimes when they're calling our 24-hour multilingual hotline, they're not calling out of curiosity, they're calling out of desperation. A desperation because they've tried everything they could and they know that they have to leave, otherwise the well-being and their lives and their children's lives are in danger. Next slide, please. So with shelters, as I said, we do have shelter programs, emergency shelter, and 2 transitional shelter programs. And in LA County, there's about 20 domestic violence organizations and shelter programs. So we are quite fortunate, but yet again, it is not enough to really meet the need of all of the domestic violence and sexual assault survivors that are in need of immediate safe shelter. So grappling with the lack of resources, the lack of funding, then COVID-19 arrives. And I would say that as soon as it arrived, from the mid-March all the way through to August, and where we currently are right now, there's always been a threat that as we are isolating in our homes, as we are sheltering in place, as we are experiencing quarantine and lockdowns, that the fear that domestic violence is going to rise was not just a fear from domestic violence providers. It was a fear, and it was actually a reality for so many different areas, countries, places. And I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what this means in terms of how we provide services. And you can see from The Guardian, from The Interpreter, from Psychology Today, all of these are just different headlines. There's hundreds of articles from the time that we were put in sheltering in place, sheltering at home, lockdown, hundreds of articles that were talking about the fears and then ultimately the inevitable rise of sexual violence, of domestic violence for so many survivors who could not find a place to go. So really just illustrating how imperative it is that we continue our shelter-based services. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk briefly about our shelters, our emergency and transitional shelter, and really how we provide services. As Shirley and Nusrat talked about their services and also the trauma-informed practices, really trauma-informed care and practices begins with what the survivor wants. And that is like the core of how we provide our services, because we are not the people who are going to be impacted by decisions. It ultimately is the client and their children. Next slide, please. So a lot of our focus has to be on a variety of different aspects of healing. And when you're talking about trauma from domestic violence and trauma from sexual violence, you're talking about lifelong trauma. You're talking about trauma that is not going to be solved in a 30-day program. It's certainly not going to be solved within even a transitional shelter that will be providing case management and advocacy and shelter for a year. It is an ongoing process. And really, we are fortunate to be in a position where we are on the front lines. Even in the time of COVID, our shelter programs are still running because they are needed, because it is critical, because people are dying. People are dying at the hands of their partners, and so they do need shelter. And when they come in, the last thing that I want them to feel is that they're not in control of this. I want them to feel like they are in control, that they have the ability and the support from us to make decisions on their own. And that's not the easiest thing to do when you've had somebody who's been systematically broken down by their partners or by their loved ones. And so it really takes time and takes trust. And we really focus on being able to provide language access, being able to provide cultural competency, and being able to provide empowerment. And I don't mean empowerment just in vain, but empowerment in their capacity to choose what they want to focus on while they're in our programs. If they need time to sleep because they haven't slept in months, if they want to just make a meal for them and their children without having the threat of somebody else coming in and destroying whatever little piece, whatever little type of sacred healing that they can do for their children as they cook, that's what I want to provide. And that's what we do provide. And it's critical that in terms of shelter right now, that we see how much more vulnerable our survivors are. It was worse and a very difficult climb for our survivors to be able to gain any kind of self-sufficiency. And now with COVID, it has definitely turned things into even more dire straits and even more critical, aspects of their case that we are now grappling with. So understanding that trauma-informed practices and care, it comes from a deep, deep respect for that person, a deep admiration for the bravery that it took to leave. And we lead with that. We lead with love, and we lead with nourishment, and we lead with an expectation that there is no expectation, that they would be able to navigate and they would let us know what it is that they want, and we give them as much information as we can. So that is really the core of what our trauma-informed practices are. I was gonna put in a slide with all of our different policies and just making sure like our programs, but I really feel like just the fact that we are talking about this now in this day and age, and also this political climate and where we are going right now, it's really important to understand that, you know, you can decide how you run your programs, and you can very well decide in a very different way how to run shelter programs. But for us, understanding the impact of trauma, we have to come from a place of love, and we have to come from a place of dignity and honoring that person's journey. Next slide, please. So with the trauma-informed practices and care, we also have a whole other dynamic, which is guidelines and procedures for COVID-19. And I posted up here just a website from the Department of Public Health in LA County, as well as the CDC, because honestly, I would say from the time that we were in sheltering in place and we had to scale back on our staffing at shelters, but not stop running them. We've never stopped running them. I would say that every policy has changed, because the whole reality of COVID has been that it's been so incredibly uncertain, and you know, even health guidance has been changing. So I put these two websites on because these are the websites that I look at on a daily basis. And we just have to be very open and very flexible with how we're able to communicate to our clients. One of our shelters, well, the majority of our shelters are congregate settings. With our emergency shelter, we do have communal living, and that has been difficult to try to figure out what is the requirement. How are we going to have small children wear masks together if they're cooking together, if they're going to the same kind of bathroom, if they have to share communal areas. And it really is looking at how we can make it work and still make them feel safe and still make them feel like they are somewhat in control. So getting guidance from your local health department is really critical, as sometimes the health department will customize and fine-tune their guidance based on your county's COVID positive, COVID-related deaths. So it's really imperative, and I really encourage for those who are working in shelter to get that guidance. You know, for personal protective equipment is also a huge thing. Being able to be in contact with our Department of Public Health has been instrumental. Our DV coalitions do try to mobilize and get as much personal protective equipment as possible. So, you know, every day there's something new. Sometimes I'll put out a huge, long email policy about, okay, this is what we need to do. Initially, when we're saying, you know, people don't need to necessarily wear a mask when they're talking to each other going out. And then we were told, okay, now everybody has to wear masks. So it's an ongoing fluid situation, but I think as long as you're able to communicate this to your clients as well as your staff, and being able to hear their concerns, then that's how you're able to be more effective in your whatever policies you put into place. And understanding that for people who are also isolated and their families are not here and they may be in other countries, to allay their fears and let them know that we're right there in this journey with them, and that as we change our policies to best reflect the guidance of the health department, we will inform them and we will walk with them in this journey together. Next slide, please. So our emergency shelter, these are a couple of pictures from one of my favorite areas, which is our living room communal area, which is quite large and airy. We do have rest periods. We have communal living, women and children programs. The majority of our clients have been women who have been fleeing from their intimate partners. But we definitely are LGBTQ plus friendly, and we want to make sure that we are trying to be inclusive as possible. Our services are offered in many different languages. We do have case management, advocacy. I mean, essentially our staff are really literally picking up the pieces of whatever the survivor is wanting help with and being able to work with them on a day-to-day basis. And our emergency shelter is 3 to 6 months. Next slide, please. And our transitional shelters, we have 2. Those are longer term shelters, 1 year. And we do have apartment style units. Our women and children programs across the board within all of our shelter programs range from financial literacy. A lot of times, because financial abuse has been it's been so embedded in many, if not all of the clients that come into our programs, they don't have much in terms of either knowledge or resources, or their financial resources have been completely exploited by their partners. And so it's really trying to figure out what it is that they have when they come into our program. So we basically collaborate with local banks that were able to provide financial literacy periods. We also provide domestic violence and sexual assault education. We do healing groups. We have acupuncturists that come to our program, and really not even having to have any conversation with the clients, but just to offer that. We try to do meditation, yoga. We also have children's programs as well that really focus on art through healing. A lot of times children are not able to articulate what it is they had to go through. And so being able to provide a safe space for art is really what's key. And, you know, our kids are just incredibly creative. And a lot of times there's some dark stuff that comes out of that. And I'm so thankful that we're able to provide that for them. As I'm talking, I do see people asking, like, what is a rest period? Initially, when somebody comes into our program, in particular our emergency shelter program, we encourage them to rest, to be able to, oftentimes they have so many questions, and we try to answer them as much as possible, but we also want them to be more familiar with the shelter. So we encourage them to rest. We encourage them to get to know the other residents. But, you know, it just depends. It's a case by case. If people can rest and if they can get the sleep and the nourishment that they haven't been able to get because they spent months trying to figure out how they're going to get out, you know, then, I mean, it really depends on that person. So all of our programs are fluid. We have to meet the need of the population that we currently have, and it constantly changes, in particular with our emergency shelter program. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to say thank you for being able to be open to listening to what our trauma-informed services are in shelter. I could go on, but there are, Nat is up next, and she's going to talk more about our community programs, but I would love to answer any other questions that you have. And I will leave you with this. You know, yesterday we actually moved out one of our Korean families who, when she came in to our emergency shelter, and she was terrified. And I remember her fear getting out of the taxi and not knowing what to expect, and having her little 8-year-old daughter also be terrified as well. They'd been through hell, and it was so difficult trying to get them out because the person who was doing harm to them would never leave the home. So when she was able to get that opportunity, she came out, and we were able to bring her in. And I remember how fearful she was. And I remember her walking into our kitchen and just immediately being comforted because she saw Korean groceries. She saw food items that she could relate to. And she instantaneously was like, I need to make a meal for my daughter and me. And we were like, yes, absolutely, please. And then from there, it has just been a progression for her. And yesterday she had left our transitional shelter and moved into her own apartment. And I have to say, that is the beauty of the work that we do. It's not always like that. Sometimes they do go back, and we have to honor where they are at. But being able to offer this sanctuary and continuing to prioritize their needs and their feelings is really the way that we're going to make changes, positive changes for anyone that walks through our doors. So thank you so much for the opportunity for me to be able to talk a little bit more about our programs.
Thank you, Fatima. This is Shirley again. I just want to say, from my perspective, it's so powerful and moving to hear your presentation. It's like a form of grounding and reminder of what we do, what is at the core of what we do, and to really think about survivors as being at the center. So thank you for that. Next, we have Nat, also from CPAF. She is the Community Program Director. She works to provide education and awareness around domestic and sexual violence through community programs and school-based programs to promote leadership in the community.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank Nusrat and also Fatima as well for the previous presentation. I think I would like to take some time, the next 15 to 20 minutes to really get to the core of the cultural value and also how culture actually plays a significant role when it comes to trauma-informed care, trauma-informed practices, and how we view trauma. Before I start, it will be really appreciated if you all can just type into the chat of how do you identify yourself when it comes to ethnicity. The reason I asked you to do that, hopefully throughout the conversation and discussion and the presentation that I will be sharing, keep that in mind, and how your cultural perspective and view influence how you perceive, how people experience trauma as well. Thank you for sharing it and keep coming. So I think in the whole concept of trauma, right? So Andrea Lott actually talked about this in a very nice quote. She's saying that there is no thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live a single issue lives. That's exactly what the trauma is all about. And actually, the intersectionality of how we all experience trauma, that play within us, how we react to it, how we respond to it, and how the healing process that we all are in the different journey as well. So there's no one path when it comes to healing to trauma. And that's why, the element of culture is so important. Next, please. So what I will be sharing with you, again, the content that I want to share is around the community need assessment that we did or we took part of with other organizations in Los Angeles. And then I would like to talk about the overarching theme that actually emerged from that assessment. And then we'll be exploring the risk factor and also the protective factor that will be very relevant to the situation that we are facing during the pandemic as well. Next, please, Shirley. So the community need assessment. So this is a 1 year work that about 6 to 7 organizations that actually work together. So the work led by special service for group as the evaluation and research department, working with the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, and also us as the Center for Pacific Asian Family, and other 4 organizations. And within this collaboration, we actually work closely with the ethnic community in LA County. And some of those organizations have the specialty in working with domestic violence and sexual assault, like what Fatima was saying. Some of us do provide the shelter program for domestic violence and sexual assault survivor. Some of us doing the community-based programming. So no matter what aspect of domestic violence and sexual assault services that we provide, the core that we do is we need to understand the community needs. So that's why we come together with the support of Blue Shield Foundation. We'll be able to get more in depth, around the community need. So that is our objective. So the objective is to really looking at culturally and linguistically appropriate assessment that accommodate the participant who may not speak English, particularly the monolingual population, to articulate their experiences around gender norm, role of culture, looking at the, how the relationship dynamic work within the family. And we hope that at the end of this assessment, we'll be able to come up with the engagement strategy within those ethnic communities differently. And also, as part of what CPAF is committed to do is to looking at how we engage parents, how we engage youth, and how we're looking at the intergenerational context within the community engagement. So the community that we actually explore are the 5 communities: Cambodian, Chinese, Korean, North Indian, Hindu, and Pakistani Muslim in those 5 communities. Next, please. So the methodology that we use for the assessment is, around the survey, focus group discussion. The focus group discussion divided into 3 different groups, to parents, with youth, and also the community leader or the community partner who are embedded themselves in those community. And also those focus group discussion deliver in the language that they speak in that ethnic community. Some of those, if they feel comfortable to communicate in English, we will also provide the focus group discussion and communicate in English as well. Next, please. So here is the overarching theme of our finding. And I think, what I want to remind you as well when I go through this presentation, I want to ask this question early on. How do you see this, the overarching theme emerge within the COVID-19 context? What I want to put it out now is that, this context of cultural way, norms and gender norm, and also the way that we look at different things, it's there before COVID. But because of COVID, it's highlights some of those overarching things to the level that, become the greater need than before. So I think I just want to address it right there and then, because, with what Pratima said earlier about the work that we do as an organization, for the community program, we're responsible for the crisis intervention, which is 24/7 hotline, responding to those crises and the call that coming in. We also provide non-shelter survivor, those who may not need the shelter, but they need the emotional support, maneuver through the system during COVID, court orders, so on and so forth. And also we provide the healing group as well. And then the other part is, how do we prevent, domestic violence and gender-based violence or violence against women really in the community as early on? How do we catch it before it's become, an issue? So that's what we do. So let me go through some of this overarching theme, so we will help you, get some perspective. So the first one is intergenerational immigrant experiences. As you know, that those 5 communities, either Chinese, Cambodian, Indian, Hindu speaking, I think we need to be aware that the historical context of those particular group are very different. So for each of the 5 communities in the study, these are related in so many ways, because the way that parents experience the immigration processes, or how the parents experience the historical context, and the grandparents that experience the historical context are very different. It depends on which point in time that they are at, what are the reasons that they migrate from their home country to America, and what is the historical context of America at the time too, that how it contributes to how they are perceived and how they adjust into the culture. This is actually linked significantly to the condition around, surrounding the family immigration story, and how the story or narrative being told and understood as well within the family and also within the community. For some community group, this reflected experiences, from escaping the violence, and also other experiences reflect the pursuit of economic opportunity, which depending on, like I said, the country of origin, right? And also this show the differences and diversity that they bring. It doesn't mean that, Chinese speaking person that you interact with will represent the whole, Chinese population. That's not the case. And I think that this is one of the key findings that I want to articulate it here with all of you. That's why I asked you to put the ethnicity in the chat box. A lot of time we make certain assumption that all Asian are alike, right? Or African American are alike. It's not at all. Everybody who come from the different ethnic, even though the same ethnicity, are different as well, because the family value, the social group that they belong to within their own ethnicity are very different, and those will distinct, the need will distinct into the way that we need to work with them, the way that we need to communicate with them, and also the healing process that appropriate to where they are. So that is very important. The second part, beyond the intergenerational immigrant experiences, is around, the gender norm and the gender value, the male dominance and gender equity. A lot of those community, like Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and also in Khmer as well, for Cambodian, male dominance was a pervasive theme across those communities. The formal rules, informal social expectation, and more visible habits and attitudes that reinforce the norm that men occupy the position of power within that family and across society. So this is acceptable norm that it's okay for men to take over the financial status and take over, the decision-making power within the family, and more opportunity are provided to men, right? And that become accepted norm within that family. What would that look like for those who from the country that believe that it's okay and it's accepted, because that's been something that they experience from generation to the generation, and coming to the US and realize, you know what, actually it's not okay. How would different opinion of the way that you're looking at male dominance and gender equity could, bring some of those feeling and emotion and conflict as well of how they perceive, the gender role. So I think I just want to re-emphasize that. And again, and as you're aware, Shirley brought up in some, with the spiral, a little bit of the gender-based violence, and also how this contribute into, the act of violence. Male dominant becomes such a fundamental belief and issue that we need to change that narrative. We need to really address some of those and help, the community that we work with, particularly the community leader and those who actually could influence within the ethnic community, to shift some of those paradigm, to help people see that it's not necessarily, male that will take certain role, will do certain thing, and will hold certain power, and what that would look like. Even in the religious as well, I think this is a thing that, we notice in many religions across the different 5 groups, is that who's the religious leader in those associations. Oftentimes it's a male figure that actually will lead, a certain belief within the religious, and will convey certain messages, and again, when you're part of the religious, your need there is to get that sense of belonging, right? So when you get the message from the male dominant religious leader, you feel like, oh, this is associated to me, something that I have to obey, something that I have to believe, something that I have to adopt as a norm and practices. So again, those norm and practices become internalized practices that actually do harm to the individual from those culture. The third one is around the role of marriage. So this one, it's quite visible to the South Asian community, because if you're looking at the dynamic of the role of marriage, it's not just the 2-person anymore, because I'm talking about here of the arranged marriage, of who pick your partner, when you want to marry somebody. A lot of the time there are that concept of arranged marriage still exists, and within that arranged marriage, the mother-in-law or the father-in-law or in-law family play a significant role to whether, using the power over the individual within the family, and oppress when it comes to resources. Like, you can't make this decision, it's my son who make the decision, and I'm gonna reinforce my son to make that decision. So it's tied closely to the male dominant culture, traditional and norm, into this role of marriage as well. So this consideration is kind of prioritize the bond of marriage as an institution over the interpersonal relationship, which can lead to the maintenance of the unhealthy dynamic, which covering, it's kind of like hiding, you know, the family business or covering up instance of violence. So as a result, violence is not broadly discussed among family members at church or across broader social network. So again, anything that's happening within the family will stay within the family, which I will explore a little bit more later as well. The next one is around relationship learning. Again, participants in this community assessment, they discuss the premarital dating in the context of family expectation, rules, and relationship learning. So norms in the community that acknowledge the premarital relationship prohibit dating before college. And as you, I mean, if you have Asian friends, I would encourage you to, you know, have that open conversation and ask them, like, what are the expectations of your parents when it comes to dating? And I can guarantee that some of them would just say, we actually never talk about it. And the expectation of my parent is that you go to school first. Education is the most important thing. So what does that mean then if this conversation around premarital dating never been discussed, where the concepts are coming from when it comes to the actual dating, right? So that becomes something that, again, from this assessment, we trying to think a little bit further of how can we help create that space between parents or grandparents and also with children and youth and young adult as well, to look at the relationship differently, right? And also introduce this whole concept of dating, let alone the sexual reproductive health, you know, conversation or sex education at home. So virtually all participants across the 5 communities reported substantial barrier to communication between youth and parents, particularly around dating and intimate relationship. So participants describe communication that does happen between generations as much more commonly around, you know, indirect rather than the direct conversation. For instance, so parents will intentionally model a relationship for their children, and children will observe how their parents and how their peer parents interact. So it's pretty much like, okay, I can't tell you, I can't talk about it, but I'm gonna show you how I interact with others, so you observe, but there's no discussion or conversation about it. So a lot of youth participants in this community assessment, they indicated that they felt that their parents were not a trusted source when it comes to the information about dating, or even, you know, help them to understand it about dating or relationship. They felt that, you know, it's a very vulnerable place to be with their parent to talk about this whole intimacy aspect of the relationship. So I think for me, this is the most important key for us to be more aware of, is that, but what does it mean for someone who experienced sexual assault, that within the family, first of all, you don't talk about this. And when someone who trying to have a dating relationship before they graduate or before they, maybe during the time of middle school or high school, but you can't talk about it with your parent. And then at the time, you didn't realize it was sexual, you know, assault event that happening to me, because there's no knowledge or understanding or even the cultural context to explain it. So later on in life, you realize that something that happened to you at the age of 14 or 15, it actually have a negative impact to how you interact with others until, you know, early adult or late adulthood. And what does that mean when we talk about trauma? Fatima addressed it in a way that trauma is not one single thing that you deal with it, you're done. Trauma is, again, is passing on from generation to generation that reinforce it in so many ways, that, you know, causing harm. And once when you know, experience another trauma that you didn't realize it was a negative impact to your life, it actually, you know, take a lot of time to really unpack some of those things. So that's why, you know, for CPAF as an organization, we realize, you know what, we cannot only do the intervention program. We cannot only do the crisis intervention anymore. We have to move our work a little bit more beyond the crisis intervention. We have to work with the community. We have to understand what the community really are, value when it comes to healthy relationship, when it comes to boundary, when it comes to traditional norm and practices, whether harmful or whether become the protective factor for them. So that's why this, assessments really helpful for us to have that understanding. So last but not least, one of the key things that we realize that it's a cross-cutting theme within the 5 community is saving face. So the concept and practice of saving face was very common, looking at the way that how family deal with the issue that happening within the family. So family do not want to raise up issue that might attract the negative attention or lead to the social ostracism, right? So, I mean, you don't want anybody to know what's happening. I mean, what are the dark side? What are the negative thing within the family? It's about let's keep it together, because if something slip out of the family, it's going to ruin the whole reputation of your family and the next generation. Moreover, saving face manifests as a concern among youth who did not want to worry that their parents or were hesitant to put parent in the position where they may have to choose between their children, health, and also the family name. So this is a very, interesting dynamic that at some point in certain culture, you have to choose. Are you going to support your children or are you going to protect your family name, which whatever that come out, in a negative way in your family, what are the impact, and majority of the time we see a lot of, child abuse case and also the potential abuse within the family that because of this reason, when it comes to saving face, and they apparently parents and community chose to protect each other rather than the children and the youth themselves. Next, please, Shirley. So yeah, I'm gonna go through this very quickly. There's a lot more detail, and the report itself is not yet finalized, but I can share some preliminary if you're interested to learn. And as I said, this is specifically from Los Angeles County and California context. So again, within those assessments, there are themes that's been pulling out from the assessment. As I mentioned, the cultural dynamic became such a significant element, looking at what do we mean by culture and what do we mean by culture as a whole and cultural community. Because if you identify yourself as Korean, it doesn't mean that you adopt the mainstream Korean culture, because you're also part of the certain group within the Korean that play significant role in your identity, your norm, your practices, particularly those who actually move from the original country to America as well. So I think that's another thing that we need to consider. I already mentioned the role of marriage and also gender role, so that's very significant. Next, please. So attitude and perception, again, the saving face value thing that I just shared, it does reflect in that attitude and perception of like, it's not for me to judge, don't judge me, because it's so important that my best value within the community of who I am for my family and who we are as the family to the community is so important, right? And then the dominant paradigm of the mainstream culture, it's very important for us to really understand that. And then again, gender role come to play when it comes to the dominant paradigm, and the male dominance, and also the relationship of the in-law family within the marriage as well. Next, please. So the family dynamic, I already shared that the communication become a critical element of whether you're going to do harm to children within your family or you're going to actually support them or create that space for them. Because majority of the community that we learn from, all the communication is very indirect between generation, particularly the sensitive issue. and especially the intimate relationship. And then again, is it fair for the situation within the family that, okay, I'm not going to talk to you about it, but I'm going to show you how to do it. But then you never discuss about what you see and what you observe within that dynamic. So I just want to ask you again to think about what that will look like, you know, when it comes to the perception and understanding of healthy relationship, intimate relationship, and also the aspect of violence. So again, parents are involved in the children's relationship, like I mentioned, around arranged relationship. I know what best for you, so I'm going to do it for you. So that's always been a practices that still exist today. Next, please. So again, you know, I already talked about the relationship, so I'm going to skip to this one and then move to the next one. Next, please. Yeah, okay, so here's the thing about the risk factor. Like I said, this exists before COVID-19, but because of COVID-19, it highlights some of these risks even more. You know, when everybody have to stay home, when everybody are in the same space together. And just imagine the context that I gave you earlier, that when parents do not communicate to children and youth at home, when the conversation about relationship, intimacy, so on and so forth, never been a direct conversation, what that will look like. And the patriarchal norms and the gender norm, you know, male dominant, it's at display at home. How does that make an impact on children and youth who are, you know, staying at home and going through some of those difficulty and, you know, experiences during COVID? And again, you know, I already talked about saving face. And this is one of the things that majority of domestic violence survivor and sexual assault are not reporting, you know, because they have that shame, right? They feel so shameful that if I articulate some of my experiences relating to domestic violence or sexual assault, will that do harm or make my family or my community lose the face? What do I have to choose here? So I think that's one of the key things. An external stressor, I think, you know, like I said, being a new immigrant, it's already hard enough to adjusting, and you carrying a lot of baggages, like I shared earlier, of the, you know, traditional norm and practices in your origin country. Now you come to the US, you expect to act certain way, talk, speak certain languages, and understand all of the norm that's been in place for a very long time in a very short time. So that has been a struggle, right? So I think that's something that, you know, we need to understand, that because of COVID-19, there are external stressors as well, you know, the loss of job, the employment, the economic stability, and so on and so forth. So that is something that we can unpack more too. Next, please. So to the hopeful one, and what can we do then after we learn all of this information? I think, you know, we need to consider, okay, among all of those risk factors and the truth and fact about the cultural norm and practices, what are the things that actually could turn to become the protective factor that we can strengthen, right? We know that the family are always together, and they really, you know, they go through all of these experiences together, though differently. But one thing that we know, that they value a lot around family and community. How can we maximize those relationships? So we need to identify the influencer, and also, you know, who can actually help shape some of those dynamics. Role model is so important. If we want to shift the male dominant paradigm to much more gender inclusive and gender equity, female leader within the home, within the community need to be promoted and need to be part of the influencer. Last but not least is the empathy in all of this is very important. You need to understand that, you know, the context that I give to you earlier is not for anybody to judge anybody, but it's about understand their needs or the unmet need that happening along, you know, their life or historical context, so on and so forth, that come to the US. How can we ensure that, you know, those are unpacked and addressed, and then move forward with, okay, what are the things that we can do together? You need to put yourself in their shoes of those struggle by understanding their context. And then this also benefit the work that we do significantly with the advocate and survivor as well, that once when we listen to them and we allow them to be able to unpack some of those, it has helped us a lot to be able to identify what is the right, support that we can get. At the moment may not be the support that right away, I am domestic violence survivor, or I am a sexual assault survivor. It could be I need financial aids for this, or I need financial assistance, or I need legal assistance. But from then, that is the entry point that we can help and support them. So let me go to the last slide, Shirley. Next, please. Yeah, so I think here's the information that I like to share, and I know I take a lot of time. There's so many learning coming out from the community assessment, which I'm happy to share. We have an upcoming advocate training. It's a free virtual platform that we provide to all the advocates. If you're interested to learn the Southern California context, feel free to do so. And here's information about our program as well on the website. So thank you so much all for listening. I know that it could be more engaging, but I hope that you get some, key point and the knowledge from this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nat, for sharing about that community assessment. I think there's a lot of information and knowledge and experiences that came out of that are useful to all of us in our work. We have a couple of minutes left for questions and answers. As you can see, there's a slide with resources up. I'll send an email to everybody after today's webinar with links to these, so there's no need for you to take them down now. A couple minutes left for questions. I know there are a few that came up. And if you have additional ones, just send them to my email, sluo@api-gbv.org. Somebody asked, how can transformative justice frameworks be incorporated into trauma-informed approaches when supporting survivors within our community? And I think this is something that came up during Nusrat's presentation. So if you'd like to speak to that, or if Nat or Fatima have any insight, that would be great to hear as well. You're on mute if you're speaking.
Sorry. So when we're talking about transformative justice, we need to understand that what does it look like, right? It's a survivor-focused, trauma-informed community in accountability to end that injustice, right? And that's what I was talking about. That, for example, when a police officer goes to the scene of sexual assault, and the person may not be ready to now talk about that, or may not, and then what does it? Do they dismiss it? Do they don't dismiss it? And that is where the transformative justice, that is what it looks like. It necessitates for the law enforcement officer to be more cognizant and more trauma focused, to understand that maybe this is, it will come later, or maybe they cannot just dismiss this right away, right? There are so many factors, so many barriers associated to it, where this is not possible, maybe at that point. So when we are talking about justice and how justice look, and I've mentioned in my presentation that it has to be in a very survivor-focused, healing way. So what can we do as advocates? We have the responsibility to train the law enforcement, to train the criminal justice system, to make concerted efforts to have them listen about how the journey of a survivor, especially if the survivor is immigrant, takes place. Maybe her immigration is related to it, right? And she's thinking of being deported if she's, reporting. So all of this has to be taken into account when a person is faced with the consequence of, taking it to the criminal justice, and that criminal justice will actually have her deport deported from the country. So how would that look like? So that is what transformative justice looks like if everyone is trauma informed, survivor focused, and come together and for the accountability, because there is an accountability and collective action that comes from it, and recognizing the cultural difference. And I can just go on, and I think if the attendee wants me, I can, later email or be in touch to talk about more on this.
Thank you. And I think that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you all, three of you, so much for taking the time out of everything that you have and being on the front lines to share with everybody today. And I want to thank everybody who's joining us on this webinar. We'll send out follow-up emails to everybody with the slideshow, resources, and our emails. And like I said, feel free to email me if you have any additional questions. I know there's some we couldn't get to today, but I've taken those down. And I'll try to address those in the future. So thank you so much and have a good day.